Are you terrified to face your deepest fears? This video was generated by AI for entertainment purposes, and all characters, places, and events are fictional. Please enjoy. 17-year-old Daniel tossed and turned in his bed. Sleep wouldn't come. The room was silent except for the occasional creak of the house settling, but his mind was anything but quiet. Earlier that evening, his friends had dared him to spend the night in the old graveyard. They had laughed and joked, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in his stomach. The thought both terrified and intrigued him. He had always been fascinated by the stories of ghosts and spirits, but the idea of facing them alone in the dark was another matter entirely. Daniel glanced at his clock. Midnight. He sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the dare pressing down on him. The witching hour, they called it. The time when the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest. The dare had been weighing heavily on his mind all evening. He had tried to distract himself with homework and video games, but nothing could take his mind off the impending challenge. He knew it was foolish, but something inside him, perhaps a desire to prove himself to his friends, urged him on. He didn't want to be seen as a coward. He couldn't shake off the feeling that he had to do it. It was as if an invisible force was pulling him towards the graveyard, daring him to face his fears. With a determined sigh, he threw the covers off and got out of bed. His heart pounded in his chest, but he knew there was no turning back now. A chill ran down his spine as he pulled on his clothes. The air in his room felt colder than usual, almost as if the spirits were already aware of his intentions. He tried to convince himself it was just the cool night air, but the goosebumps on his arms told a different story. He rubbed his arms, trying to shake off the eerie feeling, but deep down he knew it was fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of what he might encounter in the graveyard, and fear of failing the dare. He took a deep breath and steeled himself for the night ahead. He quietly left the house, the only sound the creaking of the old door. The night air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something vaguely unsettling. Daniel shivered. He pulled his jacket tighter around him as he walked. The old graveyard was on the outskirts of town, nestled among gnarled trees and shrouded in an eerie silence. It was a place most people avoided, especially at night. Daniel could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he approached the rusted iron gates. He took a deep breath and pushed the gates open. They groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the stillness of the night. He stepped inside, the feeling of dread intensifying with each step. The full moon cast long, eerie shadows among the crooked headstones. The silvery light bathed the graveyard in an otherworldly glow, making the shadows dance and flicker as if they were alive. The air was heavy with an oppressive silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He felt a shiver run down his spine, and it wasn't from the cold. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like a drum. He walked deeper into the graveyard, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The further he went, the more the shadows seemed to close in around him, wrapping him in a cloak of darkness. The path was overgrown with weeds and vines, making it difficult to see where he was going. Each step was a struggle, the undergrowth tugging at his legs like unseen hands trying to hold him back. He stumbled over a gnarled root, cursing under his breath. The sudden jolt sent a fresh wave of fear through him, and he had to take a moment to steady himself. He felt a growing sense of unease. It was as if the very ground beneath his feet was alive, pulsing with a dark energy that seeped into his bones. He stopped to catch his breath, his gaze falling on an ancient tombstone. The stone was weathered and cracked, covered in moss and lichen that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. The inscription was barely visible in the moonlight. He could just make out the faint outlines of letters, worn away by time and the elements. He leaned closer, squinting to make out the words. His breath fogged the air in front of him, and he could feel the cold seeping into his bones. As he read the inscription, a cold wind swept through the graveyard, chilling him to the bone. The wind seemed to whisper through the trees, carrying with it the faint echoes of voices long silenced. Daniel shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around him as he tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. The words on the tombstone were just barely legible, but they sent a chill down his spine. Here lies the forgotten, the lost, the damned. He took a step back, his heart racing. The graveyard seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. He knew he had to leave, but something held him there, a morbid curiosity that he couldn't shake. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart, and turned to leave. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was following him. He quickened his pace, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. The graveyard seemed to stretch on forever, the path winding through the darkness like a serpent. He stumbled again, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see the gate in the distance, the iron bars glinting in the moonlight. He broke into a run, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached the gate and threw it open, stumbling out into the night. He didn't stop running until he was far away from the graveyard, the shadows and the whispers left behind. He collapsed on the ground, his heart still racing, and looked back at the graveyard. It seemed to loom in the distance, a dark and foreboding presence. He knew he would never forget this night, the night he took the path less traveled. Daniel's heart pounded in his ears. He could have sworn he heard a whisper, a faint ethereal sound that seemed to come from the shadows. He spun around, his eyes scanning the darkness, but he saw nothing. He told himself it was just the wind playing tricks on his overactive imagination. But the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He couldn't shake off the feeling that he was being watched. He continued down the path, his pace quickening. The whispering started again, this time closer, more insistent. He could almost make out words, but they were too faint, too fleeting. They sent chills down his spine. Section 5, A Figure in the Fog. A thick fog began to roll in, blanketing the graveyard in an eerie silence. Daniel felt a surge of panic. He was lost, alone, and surrounded by the unknown. He shivered, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Then he saw it. A figure standing at the end of the path, shrouded in fog. He couldn't make out its features, but he could feel its eyes fixed on him. He froze, his mind racing, his body trembling. The figure took a step forward, then another. It was getting closer. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. He was paralyzed with fear. Daniel closed his eyes, willing himself to wake up from this nightmare. But when he opened them again, the figure was still there. Closer now, its form becoming clearer in the swirling fog. He could see now that it was tall and slender, its clothes tattered and torn. Its face was hidden in the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The figure stopped a few feet away, its eyes boring into him. Daniel felt a cold dread grip his heart. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. He was utterly terrified. The figure reached out a hand, its touch icy cold. Daniel screamed, a primal sound of pure terror, and stumbled backward, tripping over a tombstone. He lay there for a moment, his chest heaving, his mind reeling. When he looked up, the figure was gone. The fog had lifted and the moon was hidden behind a cloud. He was surrounded by darkness. He was alone. He staggered to his feet, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had to get out of there. He ran blindly through the graveyard, his mind a jumble of fear and confusion. The first rays of dawn found Daniel huddled beneath a large oak tree at the edge of the graveyard. He was shaking uncontrollably, his clothes torn and his face streaked with dirt and tears. He looked up at the rising sun, his eyes vacant and unseeing. He remembered nothing of the night before, nothing of the fog, the whispers, or the figure. All he felt was a bone-deep exhaustion and a terror that seemed to cling to him like a shroud. He was found by a group of joggers who were shocked by his appearance and incoherent ramblings. They called for help, and Daniel was taken to the hospital, his mind seemingly lost in the darkness of that night. Days turned into weeks, but Daniel never fully recovered from his experience in the graveyard. His once vibrant spirit seemed to have been drained, leaving behind a shell of the boy he used to be. The hospital room, with its sterile walls and beeping machines, became his new world, a stark contrast to the life he once knew. He remained withdrawn, his eyes haunted by something he couldn't quite remember yet couldn't forget. The shadows under his eyes grew darker, and his once bright smile was now a distant memory. Friends and family tried to reach out, but Daniel seemed lost in a world of his own, a world filled with unseen terrors. He spoke of whispers and shadows, of a figure that haunted his dreams. Night after night he would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The nightmares were vivid, almost too real, and they left him trembling with fear. He described a dark figure, always lurking just out of sight, whispering his name in a voice that sent chills down his spine. The doctors diagnosed him with post-traumatic stress disorder, attributing his delusions to the trauma of being lost in the graveyard. They prescribed medication and therapy, hoping to bring some semblance of normalcy back to his life. But despite their best efforts, Daniel's condition showed little improvement. The medical professionals were baffled, unable to explain the intensity of his symptoms. But those who knew him best, those who saw the terror in his eyes, couldn't shake off the feeling that something more sinister had occurred that night. His friends and family were deeply concerned, their hearts aching as they watched him struggle. They couldn't help but wonder if there was more to his story, something that the doctors couldn't see or understand. Was it all in his mind, a figment of his imagination fueled by fear and darkness, or was there a deeper, darker truth hidden beneath the surface? Daniel spent countless hours alone, lost in thought, trying to piece together the fragments of his shattered memories. The questions gnawed at him, leaving him restless and anxious. Or had Daniel stumbled upon something real, something ancient and evil, lurking in the shadows of the old graveyard? The graveyard itself seemed to hold a malevolent presence, its ancient tombstones and twisted trees casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. The air was thick with an unsettling energy, as if the very ground was alive with dark secrets. The question remained unanswered, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lie hidden in the heart of darkness. As the days turned into months, the enigma of that fateful night continued to haunt Daniel and those around him. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, leaving everyone to wonder if they would ever uncover the truth. The graveyard, with its ancient and foreboding presence, stood as a silent witness to the events that had transpired, its secrets buried deep within the shadows.